really delighted to have you all here, and we're looking forward to a wonderful couple of days of discussion. I'm Emanuela Bianchi of the Department of Comparative Literature here at NYU, and I just wanted to make a quick word of thanks on behalf of the organizers to everyone who's helped make this happen. First, the Department of Comparative Literature itself has been extraordinarily generous, and we've also had amazing additional support from across and beyond the university, including from the Center of Ancient Studies at NYU, the Gallatin Fund for Classics in the Contemporary World, the College of Arts and Sciences at Fairfield University, the Global Research Initiatives Office at the Office of the Provost here at NYU, from Gabrielle Starr, Dean of the College of Arts and Science, and from the Humanities Initiative at NYU, from Joy Connolly at the Office of the Dean for Humanities, from the Post-Classicisms Network based at Princeton University, from the Center of the Study of Gender and Sexuality here at NYU, the Departments of English, Philosophy, Classics, Media, Culture and Communication, and the AS Onassis program in Hellenic Studies, and the program in Gender and Sexuality Studies. So a huge range of support from across many disciplines and offices. In addition, we'd like to thank our incredible administrative director at Comparative Literature, Kit Frick, for making everything happen, and our talented graduate students, Anastasia Kostriukova for the beautiful poster and program, Elizabeth Benninger for all kinds of logistical assistance. She's the one to ask if you need anything. She's back there by the door. And Agata Tumilovic, who's also helping out, she's next to her, to Chuck Gelman for the website, and also to my wonderful co-organizers, Sara, Brill, and Brooke Holmes, who've just been fantastic. Introducing our proceedings will be Joy Connolly, and Joy is Dean of the Humanities and Professor of Classics at NYU. She's author of two books, The State of Speech, Rhetoric and Political Thought in Ancient Rome, which came out with Princeton in 2007, and then most recently, The Life of Roman Republicanism, also with Princeton, and that just came out last month. So welcome, Joy.
Thanks, Emma. It's really good to be here on this surprisingly chilly morning after a warm early start of the week. I welcome everyone, and I wish you the best for the next 2 days. You're an eminent company and with wide-ranging interests that I can't even begin to try to capture in just a few minutes. I'm going to take your time today. So instead, I'm going to take the liberty of the speaker who can parachute in and just give you a couple of ideas to think about and get your mind moving at this still fairly early hour. So I'm going to start with reading a passage. You can see if you can guess what it is. I'm skipping the key first sentence, so that would give the game away. The mule driver disliked the young mule. He always put him on the left to make it easier to whip him with his right hand. And he whipped him not on his thick-skinned hindquarters, but on the belly. Once the young mule tried giving his companion a playful push, but in answer the old mule just kicked calmly and without anger and turned away. Later, every part of their lives became harder. The mules got to know cold and the way their hides shivered after being soaked by the autumn drizzle. Mules coughed and caught pneumonia. The young mule became a shadow of himself, and this living ashen shadow could no longer sense either its own warmth or the pleasure that comes from food and rest. Anyone guess this one? I'll give the game away. So Vasily Grossman, this is his short story, The Road, and he's meditating through the body and the thoughts of the mule on the dehumanizing power of world war. But the passage for me, when I read it, made me excited to think of Grossman evoking, consciously or not, it doesn't matter, evoking another passage. And so bear with me while I read one more. Put these together. As for my fellow creatures, what a sight! how to describe their state. Those senile mules and worn-out geldings drooped their heads over the manger as they munched their heaps of chaff, necks bent and covered with vile running sores, flabby nostrils distended from endless wheezing, and their chests raw from the constant friction of the harness. Their flanks were cut to the bone from relentless whipping, their hooves distorted to strange dimensions from the repetitive circling, and their whole hide blotched by mange and hollowed by starvation. So this, as you might guess now, in the first person, is Apuleius, speaking in the Metamorphoses or Golden Ass, what our colleague visiting NYU this semester, Alessandro Barchiesi, this is a book he's called The First Imperial Novel, written in the 2nd century CE, as most of you here would know, probably all of you. Well, this is one of several moments in classical antiquity, this text, which is ripe for investigation into the nature of the post-human. And I wanted to put these two passages together, partly to draw attention, emblematically, to the resonances of ancient and modern texts. Apuleius, though, is writing at a time of exploration into understanding and defining the human and the place of living things in the cosmos. It's a time of intensive work in astronomy and astrology by Ptolemy and others, when Appian, a writer I discovered just a few years ago, wrote the Halieutica, a poetic treatise on fish and fishing and hunting. And other things where he imagines fish and other animals falling in love and fighting like humans. It's a time when Galen was dissecting monkeys, the better to diagnose human ailments. Well, Apuleius, though, brings many of the themes of your conference together. As I was scanning the panels to come, I hope you hear echoes in the two passages I read, but especially the Apuleius passage. Apuleius is a Platonist and a rhetorician, so he's deeply interested in the nature of physical sensation and the sounds that words make and the power that they have, the incantatory power that words have. He's also interested in the relationship of utterance to subjectivity as an orator. He's concerned, as you heard in this passage, with contingency and pain and their role in forming experience. And he explores the borders between animal and human and divinity and the sympathies and affects that link and distinguish them. And he's interested in the regimens, again, as you heard in this passage, the regimens of social and political domination that rule animal as well as human life. He studied law, he studied magic and astrology. And I suspect from your lineup, all these topics and more are in the offing. And we're all going to come away from this conference with fresh ideas about our own being in the world and the connection between antiquity and modernity. Connections, I should have said. So you've already met and know already Emma Bianchi of NYU's Department of Comparative Literature. I'm happy to pass the podium on now to the other co-organizers, Sara Brill from the Philosophy Department at Fairfield University and Brooke Holmes from the Classics Department at Princeton University. So again, warm thanks to you for coming to speak and listen and think, and warm thanks to all of the three of you for organizing this conference. Thank you.
So thank you so much to Joy for that thoughtful and provocative introduction, and for already beginning to sort of carve out some of the conceptual space that we're hoping to inhabit over the next couple of days. It's really a pleasure to be here. I wanted to start by thanking Emma Bianchi for all of her hard work in organizing this conference. So the idea for this conference came about a couple of years ago through conversations between the three of us, but really the lion's share of the organizational work and much of the conceptual work has been Emma's, and so she really deserves our gratitude and special recognition for all that she's done to put this together and to make it possible today. So thank you very much, Emma, for making this happen. So as I said, 2 years ago, we started to think about putting together a conference that would focus in on work that the three of us were doing and that we thought a lot of other people were doing in the related fields of continental philosophy and in classics and at various intersections between them that could generously fall into new materialisms or biopolitics or the posthuman or humanities and so on and so forth. And we really thought that it would be timely to create a forum where we could bring people into conversation with one another because there hadn't been so many formal and institutional additional opportunities to sort of open up these dialogues around these topics and to make people aware of one another's work, but also create a space for sort of fruitful and productive interchange. And so we wanted to do that, and we also wanted to create an opportunity to showcase some of the really exciting work that was being done, again, in philosophy and in classics, around topics that could be loosely grouped under new materialisms, post-humanities, et cetera, et cetera. And so we were partly driven by a sense of the plenitude and the excitement of the work that was already going on, but we also were aware of a certain lacuna, we might say, in the conversations that were developing in the theoretical humanities more broadly, as well as in subfields around the new materialisms, where we felt that antiquity had sort of not had the proper place that it really deserved, had sort of fallen out of the visible conversation. And there were really, I just want to put a few reasons why why that might be the case, or why we thought that there hadn't been as much emphasis on antiquity as there might have been. For all of us who've worked in post-structuralism more broadly in various related subfields, the Greeks, for better or for worse, as the Greeks have occupied an enormously important place, in part because of the influence of French philosophy and the French philosophical education. And of course, many people in this room have done groundbreaking work on making the Greeks and the place of the Greeks in a larger philosophical conversation extremely important. But as there's been a turn away from language and the main topics of post-structuralism towards this kind of new materialisms, we felt that the place of the Greeks had sort of fallen out a bit. There is biopolitics, but in a way, the work of Agamben, and maybe to a lesser extent to Foucault, was as much a little bit of a block as an opening. There was a sense that we already knew what biopolitics was. It was Aristotle, and Agamben had already said everything. And in fact, of course, there's all kinds of fascinating and provocative and rich material in and around Aristotle that was being missed by this sort of designation of the biopolitical by Agamben as a kind of done thing. So we wanted to open up an opportunity to go back and to look at alternative, richer, more pluralistic understandings of what the biopolitical and antiquity might be, what the conceptual fertility of a term like bios and zoe, and what that opposition could be. So that was one area, was to think about how we could return the Greeks, as it were, to a place of importance and fertility within broader post-structuralist conversations. In a related sense, many of us here, and again, Sara and Emma and I in particular, have been really fascinated and provoked by work that would fall under the heading of new materialisms, particularly new materialist feminisms. But here again, it felt like antiquity and even history more generally had fallen out of the conversation as a theoretical resource and as a really radical resource for thinking the future. There is a way in which new materialism founds itself on a kind of diagnosis of biophobia that had characterized cultural studies and post-structuralism for 20-odd years, particularly in feminism. And while that has been contested slightly, there's certainly a degree of truth to which science was a realm of construction and power and authority, and not a theoretical resource that one might use in order to conceptualize alternative futures. And in the last 15 years now, and really increasingly at an increasing rate, the sciences have become a really provocative and exciting resource precisely for conceptualizing alternative futures. And we want to be part of that in thinking what discourses of materiality, what discourses of the real, what discourses of biology and physics might be productive for us to think with. But the worry is that the kind of re-enchantment of science, or kind of nostalgia for the real, can go hand in hand with a turn away from history, with a sense that the way in which the pre-modern has an ambiguous function in the history of science persists into the new materialisms, since there's nothing that can be taught from these older, archaic biologies and medicines and physics and so on and so forth. Again, of course, there are exceptions, but we thought the new materialisms could really benefit from a larger engagement with historicity. And really historicity as a way of othering ourselves in relationship to the present and being critical in a way to open up really radically and different new futures. And I think that brings me to the last point that I wanted to make, this idea of the posthuman and why we chose to sort of focus in on the posthuman. The posthuman, of course, is a term that suggests that the past is past and that the future is where we should turn our gaze, that humanism is somehow beyond us and we're now looking only forward. And by calling this Posthuman Antiquities, we wanted to sort of work that potential contradiction between antiquity and a kind of future to come, or a kind of biology to come, a materialism to come, that in fact the untimeliness that Nietzsche speaks of in his work on antiquity needed to be reintroduced into a conversation about our future and our sort of othering trajectory that we're involved in now. So it was very much our hope to create a space where we could work together, exchange ideas, open up conversations, not just for our own work and the work of antiquity and continental philosophy, not just classics, but to think about how we can create a space of engagement with larger conversations going on now in the theoretical humanities. So we're extremely excited to have everyone here, and we're looking forward to what promises to be a really innovative and exciting 2 days. And so I'll hand it over to Sara, who has some questions that we wanted to put on the table to orient our thinking.
Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. I'll be very brief, as the point is to move on to our panel, who will be responding to some of the questions I'll be throwing out there. But when we were thinking about how we'd like to structure and what the sort of motivating features of this conference were, I think we had this sense that what we wanted to highlight was the relatively broad range of modes of inquiry into the relationship between embodiment and materiality that we find in ancient thought. So rather than looking from a particular perspective about the nature of perceivable objects, thinking more carefully about the full range of the living sensorium that physis and polis offer ancient thought might be an interesting entree into this question of precisely those moments when life and living being emerge as question-worthy. So part of our interest is in exactly this kind of a meta question, that is, what are the circumstances, what are the phenomena, what are the conditions in which living beings emerge as objects of inquiry and as objects of contemplation? So, having said that, we had a few more specific questions in mind about the ancient thinking on the ontological nature of living being, on the way in which vegetality and non-human animal life open up these questions, and on the way in which even thinking about the polis, which seems so obviously to be thinking about the nature of the human realm, can't be assumed to be such when we see Aristotle do things, for instance, like attribute a bios to the polis by calling the politeia the bios of the polis. So to really resist the temptation in much of contemporary theorizing about the posthuman to draw a sharp distinction between matter and meaning, or to assume that we can draw that distinction in the ancient world. So one of the things that we're most excited about in terms of the radicality of ancient thinking that Brooke was just pointing to is precisely a resistance to that distinction between matter and meaning, and to think about the ways in which materiality erupts as a source of meaning in ancient thought. And so we were deeply delighted to receive titles and abstracts from our speakers who exceeded our imagination in terms of how we might approach questions like this. So, without further ado, I will go ahead and turn the floor over to our first panel and its moderator. Thank you so much.